The morning light filtered through broken windows of the makeshift field hospital, casting long shadows across rows of wounded men. Sister Maria Hoffman adjusted her white headpiece with trembling fingers, the fabric stained with blood that no amount of scrubbing could remove. The silence was deafening. No artillery fire, no screaming engines, just the soft moans of dying soldiers and the rhythmic drip of water from a damaged ceiling. She had been preparing bandages when the American sergeant appeared in the doorway, his uniform torn and dirty, his left arm hanging at an unnatural angle. But it wasn't his wounds that made her freeze. It was the way he looked at her. Not with the hatred she had expected, not with the contempt reserved for the enemy, but with something far more unsettling. "Ma'am," he said, in broken German, his voice barely above a whisper, "we need your help." April 1945. The Third Reich was collapsing like a house of cards in a windstorm. The Wehrmacht's once mighty war machine had been reduced to scattered remnants, desperately trying to hold together a crumbling empire. In the chaos of Germany's final weeks, the rules of war had become as fractured as the bombed-out cities that dotted the landscape. Sister Maria Hoffman had served as a Red Cross nurse for 3 years, moving from field hospital to field hospital as the front lines shifted and collapsed. She had witnessed the evolution of warfare from organized campaigns to desperate, savage encounters where survival trumped ideology. At 26, she possessed skills that had been forged in the crucible of human suffering, skills that had kept countless German soldiers alive when proper medical supplies had run out months ago. The hospital where she now worked occupied what had once been a Catholic school in the small town of Ansbach, Bavaria. The advancing American forces had swept through the region like a tide, leaving pockets of German resistance scattered and isolated. Communication lines had been severed for weeks. Supply convoys no longer arrived. The local Wehrmacht commander had abandoned his post 3 days earlier, taking most of his able-bodied men with him. What remained was a strange, liminal space where the normal rules of engagement seemed suspended. German civilians mixed with wounded soldiers. American prisoners of war shared the same cramped quarters as their former captors. And in the center of it all, a handful of medical personnel, German nurses, a French doctor captured 2 years earlier, and an elderly Austrian surgeon, continued their work with whatever supplies they could scavenge. The Americans had arrived 2 days ago, not as conquerors storming the gates, but as exhausted soldiers seeking shelter from a spring rainstorm. Their unit, what was left of it, had been separated from the main advance during a skirmish with SS holdouts. 12 men, 3 of them seriously wounded, led by a battle-weary sergeant named Thomas McKenna, who spoke fragments of German learned from his grandmother in Pennsylvania. The initial encounter had been tense. The remaining German soldiers had expected to be executed or shipped off to prisoner camps. The Americans had expected fanatical resistance. Instead, both sides had found something neither had prepared for: a shared exhaustion that transcended nationality and wounded men who needed help regardless of the uniform they wore. Dr. François Dubois, the French physician, had served as an unofficial mediator. His broken English and fluent German had helped establish an uneasy truce. But it was the severity of the medical situation that had truly broken down the barriers. When men are dying, politics becomes a luxury that few can afford. The sergeant's request hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Sister Maria looked past him to where his men had gathered. Young faces marked by fatigue and pain, their eyes holding the hollow look she had seen in so many soldiers over the past 3 years. The difference was that these were American eyes, enemy eyes, yet they reflected the same desperate hope she had witnessed in her own countrymen. "Your medic," she said carefully in English, the words feeling strange on her tongue. "Where is he?" McKenna's jaw tightened. "Dead. Sniper got him yesterday morning. My boys are hurt bad, and I—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the admission. I don't know enough to help them." The ward fell silent except for the labored breathing of wounded men. German soldiers in nearby beds had turned to watch this extraordinary scene unfold. Some faces showed curiosity, others disgust. A young Wehrmacht private, named Klaus Weber, barely 18, whispered something harsh under his breath about fraternizing with the enemy. Sister Maria felt the weight of every gaze in the room. 3 years of Nazi propaganda had painted the Americans as barbarous invaders, intent on destroying German culture and enslaving its people. Yet here was an enemy soldier, asking for her help, with a humility that spoke of desperation rather than conquest. Dr. Dubois appeared at her shoulder, his kind face worn by years of captivity and service. "The Hippocratic Oath recognizes no nationality," he murmured in German. "A wounded man is simply a wounded man." She nodded slowly and followed McKenna to where his soldiers waited. The first American she examined was barely conscious, his abdomen wrapped in a field dressing that had been soaked through with blood. His breathing was shallow and rapid, clear signs of internal bleeding that would kill him within hours without proper intervention. "What supplies do you have?" she asked McKenna. "Not much. Some morphine, bandages, and sulfa powder. We lost most of our medical kit during the retreat." Sister Maria knelt beside the wounded soldier, her trained hands gently probing his abdomen. The boy, he couldn't have been more than 19, opened his eyes and looked at her with confusion. "Ma'am, are you German?" "Yes," she replied in careful English. "But I am a nurse first." The simplicity of her statement seemed to ease something in the room. She began working with the efficiency born of 3 years treating battlefield wounds, her hands moving with practiced precision as she assessed each American casualty. The shrapnel wound in one soldier's leg, the infected bullet graze on another's shoulder, and the concussion symptoms in a third. As she worked, something remarkable began to happen. German soldiers who had been watching with suspicion started offering assistance. Klaus Weber, the young private who had whispered epithets earlier, quietly handed her clean bandages from his personal stash. An older German sergeant named Friedrich Moss, his own leg in a cast, began translating medical terms when her English proved insufficient. Leader, barriers were breaking down through the simple act of shared humanity in the face of suffering. McKenna watched in amazement as his former enemies worked to save his men. "Why are you helping us?" he asked Sister Maria as she sutured a wound with thread salvaged from a torn uniform. She paused in her work, looking up at him with eyes that held depths of experience no 26-year-old should possess. "Because," she said quietly, "the war is ending. But these boys, your boys, our boys, they still have lives to live." The truth of the war's end hung over everything like morning mist. Everyone in the room knew it, even if they couldn't speak it aloud. Germany was finished. The question now was not who would win, but how much more suffering would occur before the inevitable surrender. Over the next 18 hours, the hospital became a strange microcosm of what peace might look like. American and German soldiers shared cigarettes and stories, despite language barriers. McKenna's men taught card games to their former enemies. Sister Maria found herself explaining German medical techniques to American soldiers who peppered her with questions about treating wounds with limited supplies. The most remarkable moment came when Private Weber approached her with a notebook, its pages filled with careful diagrams and notes written in Gothic script. "My father was a doctor," he explained shyly. "Before the war, I kept his medical notes." Inside the notebook were detailed drawings of surgical procedures, medication dosages, and treatment protocols that had been refined through generations of German medical practice. Sister Maria watched as McKenna studied the diagrams with intense concentration, his finger tracing the careful lines that showed how to treat compound fractures, how to recognize the signs of gas gangrene, how to perform emergency amputations with minimal equipment. "These are incredible," McKenna breathed. "Our field manual doesn't have half this detail." "Knowledge belongs to all who would heal," Weber said, his English halting but sincere. "My father always said this." The exchange represented something profound, the sharing of life-saving knowledge across enemy lines, the recognition that healing transcended national boundaries. But it also highlighted the tragic irony of war, that young men trained to kill each other could find common ground in the desire to preserve life. As night fell, the uneasy alliance faced its first real test. A German SS officer arrived with a small patrol, demanding to know why American prisoners had not been properly secured. Captain Heinrich Stolz was a man molded by ideology, his uniform immaculate despite the chaos surrounding them, his pale eyes reflecting the fanatical certainty that had driven the Nazi war machine. "This is intolerable," he declared, his voice cutting through the hospital's peaceful atmosphere like a blade. "These are enemy combatants. They should be interrogated and transported to proper facilities." McKenna stepped forward, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm. But Sister Maria placed herself between the two men, her white uniform stark in the lamplight. "Captain Stolz," she said firmly, "these men are patients. They are under the protection of the Red Cross, as are all wounded soldiers in this facility." Stolz's laugh was bitter. "The Red Cross? Sister, the Red Cross is a fairy tale. This is war. There are only victors and the dead." "Then perhaps," Dr. Dubois interjected from across the room, "it is time to consider which we prefer to be." The standoff stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Captain Stolz's hand rested on his pistol grip, while his 3 SS soldiers flanked the doorway, their weapons at the ready. The wounded men, German and American alike, watched with the quiet intensity of those who had seen violence destroy. Too many moments of peace, Sister Maria felt the familiar weight of a decision that had defined her war. In this moment, she understood that her choice would determine not just the fate of McKenna's wounded soldiers, but the very meaning of everything she had tried to preserve amid years of destruction. "Captain," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, "I have treated German soldiers, Russian prisoners, French resistance fighters, and now Americans. I have watched boys die calling for their mothers in 4 different languages." "The sound is the same." Stolz's eyes narrowed. "Sentimental nonsense. You have forgotten your duty to the fatherland." "My duty," she replied, removing her Red Cross armband and holding it out for all to see, "is to this, to the idea that some things remain sacred even when the world burns around us." The silence stretched until it was broken by an unexpected voice. Klaus Weber, the young German private, struggled to his feet despite his injuries. "Captain Stolz," he said quietly, "the war is over. We all know it. These Americans, they could have left us to die. Instead, they shared their morphine with our wounded." Other German soldiers began to murmur in agreement. Friedrich Moss nodded slowly. "The boy speaks truth. Yesterday, I would have killed these Americans without hesitation. Today I helped save one's life. Which version of me serves Germany better?" Stolz's certainty wavered for the first time. He looked around the room, seeing his countrymen standing beside their former enemies, seeing wounded soldiers who had found common ground in suffering and healing. The ideological clarity that had sustained him throughout the war suddenly seemed fragile in the face of this human reality. McKenna stepped forward, his movements careful and non-threatening. "Captain," he said in his broken German, "my government will be here soon. Full division. You can fight, and good men will die for nothing. Or," he gestured toward the wounded soldiers around them, "or we can show them that enemies can become something else." The American sergeant reached into his pocket and withdrew a field dressing, offering it to Stolz. "Your men look tired, hungry. We have supplies we can share." For a long moment, Captain Stolz stared at the offered bandage, as if it were some alien artifact. His entire worldview had been built on the concept of eternal struggle, of irreconcilable differences between peoples. Yet here was evidence that even in war, human beings could choose cooperation over destruction. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he took the bandage. "This changes nothing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe not," Sister Maria replied gently. "But it changes something." The SS patrol departed without incident, leaving behind a hospital that had become something unprecedented, a place where former enemies had discovered their shared humanity. Over the following days, as American forces consolidated their control of the region, the story of the Ansbach Hospital spread through both armies. McKenna's wounded soldiers recovered under Sister Maria's care, while German casualties received treatment from American medics who had learned techniques from Klaus Weber's notebook. The exchange of medical knowledge continued, with both sides contributing to a growing understanding of battlefield medicine that would save countless lives in future conflicts. Dr. Dubois, finally liberated after 3 years of captivity, chose to remain at the hospital for several weeks, helping to establish formal protocols for treating former enemy casualties. His presence served as a bridge between the German medical staff and the arriving American physicians, facilitating a transfer of knowledge that transcended the animosity of war. Years later, when historians would write about the final days of the Third Reich, the small hospital in Ansbach would merit only a footnote. The great battles, the political negotiations, the formal surrenders, these were the events that shaped the official narrative of war's end. But for those who were there, the memory carried a different weight. Sister Maria Hoffman would go on to work with refugee organizations, spending her life healing wounds that went deeper than flesh. Sergeant Thomas McKenna returned to Pennsylvania, where he used the medical techniques learned from German prisoners to establish a rural clinic that served his community for 4 decades. Klaus Weber survived the war and became a doctor like his father, carrying forward both the medical knowledge preserved in his notebook and the lessons learned in a makeshift hospital where enemies discovered they could choose to heal rather than harm. The war ended, as all wars do, with treaties and ceremonies. But in a small Bavarian town, it ended with something rarer, the recognition that even in humanity's darkest hours, the impulse to preserve life could triumph over the urge to destroy it. The bandages used that April were long since discarded. The wounds healed or claimed their victims. But the idea that healing knows no nationality, that knowledge belongs to all who would preserve life, that enemies can choose to become something else, these truths endured. In the end, perhaps that is war's most profound lesson. Not that human beings are capable of terrible destruction, but that even in the midst of that destruction, some choose to remain healers. The morning light still filters through broken windows, but sometimes, just sometimes, it illuminates not the end of hope, but its quiet, persistent beginning.